This is weird. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts, which is the name of the prologue, by the way. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn's sign creaking on its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. If there had been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with conversation and laughter. The clatter and clamor one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. If there had been music, but no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, and so the silence remained. Inside the Waystone, a pair of men huddled at one corner of the bar. They drank with quiet determination, avoiding serious discussions of troubling news. In doing this, they added a small, sullen silence to the larger, hollow one. It made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wooden floor underfoot, and in the rough, splintering barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the black stone hearth that held the heat of a long-dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth rubbing along the grain of the bar. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he moved with the subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, wrapping the others inside itself. It was deep and wide and autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river's smooth stone. It was the patient, cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. Alright, Chapter 1, A Place for Demons. It was felling night, and the usual crowd had gathered at the Waystone Inn. 5 wasn't much of a crowd, but 5 was as many as the Waystone ever saw these days, times being what they were. Old Cobb was filling his role as storyteller and advice dispensary. The men at the bar sipped their drinks and listened. In the back room, a young innkeeper stood out of sight behind the door, smiling as he listened to the details of a familiar story.
When he awoke, Tablerin the Great found himself locked in a high tower. They had taken his sword and stripped him of his tools. Key, coin, and candle were all gone. But that weren't even the worst of it, you see.
Cobb paused for effect.
'Cause the lamplight on that wall were burning blue.
Graham, Jake, and Shep nodded to themselves. The 3 friends had grown up together, listening to Cobb's stories and ignoring his advice. Cobb peered closely at the newer, more attentive member of his small audience, the smith's apprentice.
You know what that meant, boy?
Everyone called the smith's apprentice boy, despite the fact that he was a hand taller than anyone else there. Small towns being what they are, he would most likely remain boy until his beard filled out or he bloodied someone's nose over the matter. The boy gave a slow nod.
The Chandran. That's right.
Cobb said approvingly.
The Chandran. Everyone knows that blue fire is one of their signs. No, he was... But how'd they find him?
The boy interrupted.
And why didn't they just kill him when they had a chance? No. Hush now. You'll get all the answers before the end.
Jake said.
Just let him tell it.
No need for all that, Jake, Graham said. Boy's just curious. Drink your drink.
I drank me drink already.
Jake grumbled.
I need another, but the innkeep's still skinning rats in the back room.
He raised his voice and knocked his empty mug hollowly on the top of the mahogany bar. Oi, we're thirsty men in here. The innkeeper appeared with 5 bowls of stew and 2 warm, round loaves of bread. He pulled more beer for Jake, Shep, and Old Cobb, moving with an air of bustling efficiency. The story was set aside while the men tended to their dinners. Old Cobb tucked away his bowl of stew with the predatory efficiency of a lifetime bachelor. The others were still blowing steam off their bowls when he finished the last of his loaf and returned to his story.
Now, Taborlin needed to escape, but when he looked around, he saw a cell had no door, no windows. All around him was nothing but smooth, hard stone. It was a cell no man had ever escaped. But Taborlin knew the names of all things, and so all things were hers to command. He said to the stone, "Break," and the stone broke. The wall tore like a piece of paper, and through that hole Taborlin could see the sky and breathe the sweet spring air. He stepped into the edge, looked down, and without a second thought, he stepped out into the open air.
The boy's eyes went wide.
He didn't.
Cobb nodded seriously.
So Taborlin fell. But he did not despair, for he knew the name of the wind, and so the wind obeyed him. He spoke to the wind, and it cradled and caressed him. It bore him to the ground as gently as a puff of thistledown, and set him on his feet softly as a mother's kiss. And when he got to the ground, he felt at his side where they'd stabbed him, and saw it wasn't hardly a scratch. Now, maybe it was just a piece of luck.
Cobb tapped the side of his nose knowingly.
Or maybe it had something to do with the amulet he was wearing under his shirt. What amulet?
The boy asked eagerly through a mouthful of stew. Old Cobb leaned back on his stool, glad for the chance to elaborate.
A few days earlier, Taborlin had met a tinker on the road, and even though Taborlin didn't have much to eat, he shared his dinner with the old man.
Right sensible thing to do, Graham said quietly to the boy. Everyone knows a tinkerer pays for kindness twice.
No,
Jake grumbled.
Get it right. A tinker's advice pays kindness twice.
The innkeeper spoke up for the first time that night. Actually, you're missing more than half, he said, standing in the doorway behind the bar. A tinkerer's debt is always paid, once for any simple trade, twice for freely given aid, thrice for any insult made. The men at the bar seemed almost surprised to see Coate standing there. They'd been coming to the Waystone every felling night for months, and Coate had never interjected anything of his own before. Not that you could expect anything else, really. He'd only been in town for a year or so. He was still a stranger. The smith's prentice had lived here since he was 11, and he was still referred to as that Ranish boy, as if Ranish were some foreign country and not a town less than 30 miles away. Just something I heard once, Coate said to fill the silence, obviously embarrassed. Old Cobb nodded before he cleared his throat and launched back into the story.
Now, this amulet was worth a whole bucket of gold royales, but on account of Tablorin's kindness, the tinker sold it to him for nothing but an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny. It was black as winter night, and cold as ice to touch. But so long as it was round for his neck, Tablorin would be safe from harm of evil things, demons and such. I'd give a good piece for such a thing these days,
Shep said darkly. He had drunk most and talked least over the course of the evening. Everyone knew that something bad had happened out on his farm last sending night, but since they were good friends they knew better than to press him for the details. At least not this early in the evening, not as sober as they were.
Who wouldn't?
Old Cobb had how do you say it?
Said Judas, no idea. He said.
He said, taking a long drink.
I didn't know Chandran were demons.
The boy said.
I heard they ain't demons.
Jake said firmly.
They were the first 6 people to refuse Terlu's choice of the path, and he cured them to wander the corners.
Curse them.
Curse them. Yeah, whatever. You telling this story, Jacob Walker? Because if you are, I'll let you get on with it.
The two men glared at each other for a long moment. Eventually, Jake looked away, muttering something that could conceivably have been an apology. Cobb turned back to the boy.
That's the mystery of the Chandran,
he explained.
Where do they come from? Where do they go after they've done their bloody deeds? Are they men who sold their souls? Demons? Spirits? No one knows.
Cobb shot Jake a profoundly disdainful look.
Though every half-wit claims he knows.
The story fell further into bickering at this point about the nature of the Chandran, the signs that showed their presence to the wary, and whether the amulet would protect
Taborlin
from bandits or mad dogs or falling off a horse. Things were getting heated when the front door banged open. Jake looked over.
It's about time you got in, Carter. Tell this damn fool the difference between a demon and a dog. Everybody knows.
Jake stopped mid-sentence and rushed to the door.
God's body, what happened to you?
Carter stepped into the light, his face pale and smeared with blood. He clutched an old saddle blanket to his chest. It was an odd, awkward shape, as if it were wrapped around a tangle of kindling sticks. His friends jumped off their stools and hurried over at the sight of him.
I'm fine,
he said as he made his slow way into the common room. His eyes were wild around the edges like a skittish horse.
I'm fine.
He dropped the bundled blanket onto the nearest table, where it knocked hard against the wood, as if it were full of stones. His clothes were crisscrossed with long, straight cuts. His gray shirt hung in loose tatters, except where it was stuck to his body, stained dark, sullen red. Graham tried to ease him into a chair. Mother of God! Sit down, Carter. What happened to you? Sit down. Carter shook his head stubbornly.
I told you I'm fine. I'm not hurt that bad.
How many were there? Graham said.
1,
Carter said.
But it's not what you think. God damn it, I told you, Carter.
Old Cobb burst out with the sort of frightened anger only relatives and close friends can muster.
I told you for months now. You can't go out alone. Not even as far as Benton. Ain't safe.
Jake laid a hand on the old man's arm, quieting him. Just take a seat, Graham said, still trying to steer Carter into a chair. Let's get that shirt off you and get you cleaned up. Carter shook his head.
I'm fine. I got cut up a little, but the blood's mostly Nellie's. It jumped on her, killed her about 2 miles outside of town, past the old stone bridge.
A moment of serious silence followed the news. The smith's apprentice laid a sympathetic hand on Carter's shoulder.
Damn, that's hard. She was gentle as a lamb, too. Never tried to bite or kick when you brought her in for shoes. Best horse in town. Damn,
He trailed off.
Damn, I don't know what to say.
He looked around helplessly. Cobb finally managed to free himself from Jake.
I told you,
he repeated, shaking a finger in Carter's direction.
There's folks out lately that would kill you for a pair of pennies, let alone a horse and a cart. What are you going to do now? Pull it yourself?
There was a moment of uncomfortable quiet. Jake and Cobb glared at each other while the rest seemed at a loss for words, unsure of how to comfort their friend. The innkeeper moved carefully through the silence. Arms full, he stepped nimbly around Shep and began to arrange some items on a nearby table. A bowl of hot water, shears, some clean linen, a few glass bottles, needle, and gut.
This never would have happened if he'd listened to me in the first place,
old Cobb muttered. Jake tried to quiet him, but Cobb brushed the younger man aside.
I'm just telling the truth. It's a damn shame about Nellie, but he better listen now or he'll end up dead. You don't get lucky twice with those sorts of men.
Carter's mouth made a thin line. He reached out and pulled the edge of the bloody blanket. Whatever was inside flipped over once and snagged on the cloth. Carter tugged harder, and there was a clatter like a bag of flat river stones upended onto the table. It was a spider as large as a wagon wheel, as black as a slate. The smith's apprentice jumped backwards and hit a table, knocking it over and almost falling to the ground himself. Cobb's face went slack. Graham, Shep, and Jake made wordless, startled sounds and moved away, raising their hands to their faces. Carter took a step backwards that was almost like a nervous twitch. Silence filled the room like a cold sweat. The innkeeper frowned.
They can't have made it this far west yet,
he said softly. If not for the silence, it is unlikely anyone would have heard him. But they did, their eyes pulled away from the thing on the table to stare mutely at the red-haired man. Jake found his voice first.
You know what this is?
The innkeeper's eyes were distant. Skyrel. Is that how we want to pronounce it? Skyrel. He said distractedly. I'd thought the mountains.
Skyle?
Jake broke in.
Blackened body of God coat. You've seen these things before.
What? The red-haired innkeeper looked up sharply as if it suddenly remembered where he was. Oh, no, of course not. Seeing that he was the only one within arm's length of the dark thing, he took a measured step away. Just something I'd heard. They stared at him. Do you remember the trader that came through about 2 span ago? They all nodded.
Bastard tried to charge me 10 pennies for half a pound of salt,
Cobb said reflexively, repeating the complaint for perhaps the 100th time.
Wish I'd bought some,
Jake mumbled. Graham nodded a silent agreement.
It was a filthy shim,
Cobb spat, seeming to find comfort in the familiar words.
I might pay 2 in tight time, but 10 is robbery.
Not if there are more of those on the road, Shep said darkly. All eyes went black in the thing on the table. All eyes went back to the thing on the table. My bad. He told me he'd heard them over near Melcombe, Coates said quickly, watching everyone's faces as they studied the things on the table. I thought he was just trying to drive up his prices.
What else did he say?
Carter asked. The innkeeper looked thoughtful for a moment, and then shrugged. I didn't get the whole story. He was only in town for a couple of hours.
I don't like spiders,
the smith's apprentice said. He remained on the other side of the table, some 15 feet away.
It's not a spider,
Jake said.
It's got no eyes.
It's got no mouth either, Carter pointed out. How does it eat? What does it eat? Shep said darkly. The innkeeper continued to eye the thing curiously. He leaned closer, stretching out a hand. Everyone edged even farther away from the table.
Careful,
Carter said.
Its feet are sharp as knives.
More like razors, Coates said. His long fingers brushed the thing's black, featureless body. It's smooth and hard like pottery.
Don't go messing with it,
the smith's apprentice said. Moving carefully, the innkeeper took one of the long, smooth legs and tried to break it with both hands like a stick. Not pottery, he amended. He set it against the edge of the table and leaned his weight against it. It broke with a sharp crack. More like stone, he looked up at Carter. How did it get all those cracks? He pointed at the thin fractures that crazed the smooth, black surface of the body.
Nellie fell on it,
Carter said.
It jumped out of a tree and started to climb all over her, cutting her up with its feet. Finally sank into the chair. Graham's urging.
Wait.
Sorry.
Start over. It jumped out of the tree.
It jumped out of the tree and it started to climb all over her, cutting her up with its feet. Moved so fast I barely knew what was going on.
I didn't even know it was going. It's fine. Carter finally sank into the chair at Graham's urging. She got tangled in her harness and fell on it, broke some of its legs. Then it came after me, got on me, crawling all over. He crossed his arms in front of his bloody chest and shuddered. I managed to get it off me and stomped it as hard as I could. Then it got on me again. He trailed off, his face ashen. The innkeeper nodded to himself as he continued to prod the thing. There's no blood, no organs, it's just gray inside. He poked it with a finger, like a mushroom.
Great Taylor, just leave it alone,
the smith's apprentice begged.
Sometimes spiders twitch after you kill them, Listen to yourselves,
Cobb said scathefully.
Spiders don't get as big as pigs. You know what this is?
He looked around, making eye contact with each of them.
It's a demon.
They looked at the broken thing.
Oh, come now.
Jake said, disagreeing, mostly out of habit.
It's not like...
He made an inarticulate gesture.
It just can't.
Everyone knew what he was thinking. Certainly there were demons in this world, but they were like Toulouse angels. They were like heroes and kings. They belonged in stories. They belonged out there. Taborin the Great called up fire and lightning to destroy demons. Telu broke them in his hands and sent them howling into the nameless void. Your childhood friend didn't stomp one to death on the road to Baden Bright. It was ridiculous. Coat ran his hand through his red hair and broke the silence. There's one way to tell for sure, he said, reaching into his pocket. Iron or fire. He brought out a bulging leather purse. In the name of God, Graham pointed out. Demons fear 3 things, cold iron, clean fire, and the holy name of God. The innkeeper's mouth pressed itself into a straight line. That's not quite a frown. Of course, he said as he emptied his purse onto the table and then fingered through the jumbled coins. Heavy silver talents and thin silver bits, copper jots, broken halfpennies, and iron drabs. Does anyone have a shim?
Just use a drab,
Jake said.
That's good iron.
I don't want good iron, the innkeeper said. A drab has too much carbon in it. It's almost steel.
He's right.
The smith's apprentice said.
Except it's not carbon. You use coke to make steel. Coke and lime.
The innkeeper nodded differentially to the boy. You'd know best, young master. It's your business, after all. His long fingers finally found a shim in the pile of coins. He held it up. Here we go.
What will it do?
Jake asked. Iron
kills demons.
Cobb's voice was uncertain.
But this one's already dead. Might not do anything.
One way to find out. The innkeeper met each of their eyes briefly as if measuring them. Then he turned purposefully back to the table and they edged further away. Coat pressed the iron shim into the black side of the creature, and there was a short, sharp, crackling sound like a pine log snapping in a hot fire. Everyone startled and then relaxed when the black thing remained motionless. Cobb and the others exchanged shaky smiles like boys spooked by a ghost story. Their smiles went sour as the room filled with the sweet, acrid smell of rotting flowers and burning hair. The innkeeper pressed the shim into the table with a sharp click. Well, he said, brushing his hands against his apron, I guess that settles that. What do we do now? Hours later, the innkeeper stood in the doorway of the waystone and let his eyes relax to the darkness. Footprints of the lamplight from the inn's window fell across the dirt road, and the doors of the smithy crossed the way. It was not a large road, nor well traveled. It didn't seem to lead anywhere, as some roads do. The innkeeper drew a deep breath of autumn air and looked around restlessly, as if waiting for something to happen. He called himself Coat. He had chosen the name carefully when he came to this place. He had taken a new name for most of the usual reasons, and for a few unusual ones as well, not the least of which was the fact that names were important to him. Looking up, he saw 1,000 stars glittering in the deep velvet of the night with no moon. He knew them all, their stories and their names. He knew them in a familiar way, the way he knew his own hands. Looking down, Coat sighed without knowing it and went back inside. He locked the door and shuttered the wide winter windows of the inn, as if to distance himself from the stars and all of their varied names. He swept the floor methodically, catching all of the corners. He washed the tables in the bar, moving with a patient efficiency. At the end of an hour's work, the water in his bucket was still clean enough for a lady to wash her hands in. Finally, he pulled a stool behind the bar and began to polish the vast array of bottles nestled between the two huge barrels. He wasn't nearly as crisp and efficient about this chore as he had been with the others, and it soon became obvious that he was polishing. Soon became obvious the polishing was only an excuse to touch and hold. He even hummed a little, although he did not realize it, and would have stopped himself if he had known. As he turned the bottles in his long, graceful hands, the familiar motion eased a few tired lines from his face, making him seem younger. Certainly not thirsty yet. Not even near thirsty. Young for an innkeeper. Young for a man with so many tired lines remaining on his face. Let me take a drink of water. Okay. Coat came to the top of the stairs and opened the door. His room was Ausper? How do you say that? Right there.
Austere?
Austere. Almost monkish. There was a black stone fireplace in the center of the room, a pair of chairs, and a small desk. The only other furniture was a narrow bed with a large, dark chest at its foot. Nothing decorated the walls or covered the wooden floor. There were footsteps in the hall, and a young man stepped into the room carrying a bowl of stew that steamed and smelled of pepper. He was dark and charming, with a quick smile and cunning eyes. "You haven't been this late in a span of days," he said as he handed over the bowl. "There must have been good stories tonight, Reshi." Reshi was another of the innkeeper's names, a nickname almost. The sound of it tugged one corner of his mouth into a wry smile as he sank into the deep chair in front of the fire. "So what did you learn today, Bass?" Or wait, I don't know who's reading this. Right there.
Today, Master, I learned what great lovers have better eyesight than great scholars.
"And why is that, Bass?" Coat asked, amusement touching the edges of his face. Bass closed the door and returned to sit in the second chair, turning it to face his teacher and the fire. He moved with a strange delicacy and grace, as if he were close to dancing. "Well, Reshi, all the rich books are found inside where the light is bad, but lovely girls tend to be out in the sunshine, and therefore much easier to study without risk of injuring one's eyes." Coat nodded, but an exceptionally clever student could take a book outside, thus bettering himself without fear of lessening his much-loved faculty of sight. "I thought the same thing, Reshi, being, of course, an exceptionally clever student." "Of course. But when I found a place in the sun where I could read, a beautiful girl came along and kept me from doing anything of the sort," Bast finished with a flourish. Coat sighed. "Am I correct in assuming you didn't manage to read any of
Selim
Tincture today?" Bast managed to look somewhat ashamed. Looking into the fire, Coat tried to assume a stern face and failed. "Ah, Bast, I hope she was lovely as warm wind in the shade. I'm a bad teacher to say it, but I'm glad. I don't feel up to a long bout of lessons right now." There was a moment of silence. Carter was attacked by a scrawling tonight. Bast's easy smile fell away like a cracked mask, leaving his face stricken and pale. "A Scrael?"
Scrael.
"Scrael? Scrael?
Yeah.
The Scrael?" He came halfway to his feet as if he would bolt from the room, then gave an embarrassed frown and forced himself back down into his chair. "How do you know? Who found his body?" "He's still alive, Bast. He brought it back. There's only one." "There's no such thing as one Scrael." "Yeah. No such thing as one Scraeling," Bast said flatly. You know that. "I know," Coat said. "The fact remains that there was only one." "And he killed it?" Bast said. "It couldn't have been a Scraeling. It couldn't have been a Scraeling. Maybe, Bast, it was one of the Scrael. I knew it. Coat gave him a serious look. He was lucky, that's all. Even so, he was badly hurt. 48 stitches. I used up nearly all my gut. Coat picked up his bowl of stew. If anyone asks, tell them my grandfather was a caravan guard who taught me how to clean and stitch a wound. They were too shocked to ask about it tonight, but tomorrow some of them might get curious. I don't want that. He blew into the bowl, raising a cloud of steam around his face. What do you do with the body? I didn't do anything with it, said pointedly. I am just an innkeeper. This sort of thing is quite beyond me. Reshi, you can't just let them muddle through this on their own. Coat sighed. They took it to the priest. They did all the right things for all the wrong reasons. Bast opened his mouth, but Coat continued before he could say anything. Yes, I made sure the pit was deep enough. Yes, I made sure there was rowan wood in the fire. Yes, I made sure it burned long and hot before they buried it. And yes, I made sure that no one kept a piece of it as a souvenir. He scowled, his eyebrows drawing together. I'm not an idiot, you know. Bast visibly relaxed, settling back into his chair. I know you're not, Rishi, but I wouldn't trust half of these people to piss leeward without help. He looked thoughtful for a moment. I need a break. I'm getting tongue-tied.
You want me to take her?
Okay. He looked thoughtful for a moment. I can't imagine why there was only one. Maybe they died coming over the mountains, Coat suggested. All but this one. It's possible, Bast admitted reluctantly. Maybe it was that storm from a couple days back. Maybe it was that storm from a couple days back, Coat pointed out. A real wagon tipper, as we used to say back in the troop. All the wind and rain might have scattered one loose from the pack. I like your first idea better, Rishi, Bast said uncomfortably. 3 or 4 Scrael? 3 or 4 Scrael would go through this town like a hot knife through butter. More like several hot knives through several dozen farmers, Bast said dryly. These people can't defend themselves. I bet there aren't 6 swords in this whole town. Not that swords would do much good against the Scrael. There was a long moment of thoughtful silence. After a moment, Bast began to fidget. Any news? Coat shook his head. They didn't get to the news tonight. Carter disrupted things when they were still telling stories. That's something, I suppose. They'll be back tomorrow night. It'll give me something to do. Coat poked his spoon idly into the stew. I should have bought the Scrael from Carter, he mused. He could have used the money for a new horse. People would have come from all over to see it. We could have had some business for a change. Bast gave him a speechless, horrified look. Sorry, reading what Aiden said. Okay. He could have used the money for a new horse. People would have come from all over to see it. We could have had some business for a change. Bast gave him a speechless, horrified look. Coat made a pacifying gesture with the hand that held the spoon. I'm joking, Bast. He gave a weak smile. Still, it would have been nice. No, Reshi, it most certainly would not have been nice, Bast said emphatically. People would have come from all over to see it, he repeated derisively. Indeed, the business would have been nice, Coat clarified. Busyness would be nice. He jabbed his spoon into the stew again. Anything would be nice. They sat for a long moment, Coat scowling down into the bowl of stew in his hands, his eyes far away. It must be awful for you here, Bast, he said at last. You must be numb with boredom. Bast shrugged. There are a few young wives in town, a scattering of daughters. He grinned like a child. I tend to make my own fun. That's good, Bast. There was another silence. Coat took another spoonful, chewed, and swallowed. They thought it was a demon, you know. Bast shrugged. Might as well be, Reshi. It's probably best thing for them to think. I know, I encouraged them, in fact. But you know what that means? He met Bast's eyes. Blacksmith's going to be doing a brisk business in the next couple of days. Bast's, Bast's expression went carefully blank. Oh. Coat nodded. I won't blame you if you want to leave, Bast. You have better places to be than this. Bast's expression was shocked. I couldn't leave, Reshi. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, at a loss for words. Who else would teach me? Coat grinned, and for a moment his face showed how truly young he was. Behind the weary lines and the placid innkeeper's expression, he looked no older than his dark-haired companion, who indeed, he gestured toward the door with his spoon. Go do your reading, then, or bother someone else's daughter. I'm sure you have better things to do than watch me eat. Actually, begone, demon, Coat said, switching to a thickly accented Temic for half a mouthful of stew. Do you want to?
Anastasia!
Bast burst into startled laughter and made an obscene gesture with one hand. Coat swallowed and changed languages.
Oh,
Oh, come now, Bast reproached, his smile falling away. That's just insulting. By earth and stone, I adjure you. Coat dipped his fingers into the cup by his side and flicked droplets casually into Bast's direction. Glamour be banished. With cider? Bast managed to look amused and annoyed at the same time as he dabbed a bead of liquid from the front of his shirt. It's better not stain. Coat took another bite of his dinner. Go soak it. If the situation becomes desperate, I recommend you avail yourself of the numerous solvent formulae extant in Selim Tincture? Chapter 13, I believe. Fine. Bast stood and walked to the door, stepping with his strange, casual grace. Call if you need anything. He closed the doors behind himself. Coat ate slowly, mopping up the last of the stew with a piece of bread. He looked out the window as he ate, or tried to, as the lamplight turned its surface mirror-like against the dark behind it. His eyes wandered the room restlessly. The fireplace was made of the same black rock as the one downstairs. It stood in the center of the room, a minor feat of engineering of which Coat was rather proud. The bed was small, little more than a cot, and if you were to touch it, you would find the mattress almost non-existent. A skilled observer might notice there was something his gaze avoided, the same way you avoid meeting the eye of an old lover at a formal dinner, or that of an old enemy sitting across the room in a crowded alehouse late at night. Coat tried to relax, failed, fidgeted, sighed, and shifted in his seat, and without willing it, his eyes fell on the chest at the foot of the bed. It was made of a rare, heavy wood, dark as coal and smooth as polished glass. Prized by perfumers and alchemists, a piece the size of your thumb was easily worth gold. To have a chest made of it went far beyond extravagance. The chest was sealed 3 times. It had a lock of iron, a lock of copper, and a lock that could not be seen. Tonight the wood filled the room with almost imperceivable aroma of citrus and quenching iron. When Coat's eyes fell upon the chest, they did not dart quickly away. They did not They did not slide slyly to the side as if he would pretend it wasn't there at all, but in a moment of looking, his face regained all the lines the simple gestures of the day had slowly smoothed away. The comfort of his bottles and books was erased in a second, leaving nothing behind his eyes but emptiness and ache. For a moment, fierce longing and regret weared across his face. Then they were gone, replaced by the weary face of an innkeeper, a man who called himself Coat. He sighed again without knowing it, and pushed himself to his feet. It was a long time before he walked past the chest to bed. Once in bed, it was a long time before he slept. As Coat had guessed, they came back to the Waystone the next night for dinner and drinks. There were a few half-hearted attempts at stories, but they died out quickly. No one was really in the mood, so it was still early in the evening when the discussion turned to matters of greater import. They chewed over the rumors that had come into town, most of them troubling. The penchant king was having a difficult time with the rebels in Reykjavik. This caused some concern, but only in a general way. Reykjavik was a long way off, and even Cobb, the most worldly of them, would be hard-pressed to find it on a map. They discussed the war in their own terms. Cobb predicted a third levy tax after the harvests were in. No one argued, though there hadn't been a three-bleeder year in living memory. Jake guessed the harvest would be good enough so the third levy wouldn't break most families, except the Bentleys, who were on hard times anyways, and the Orisons, whose sheep kept disappearing, and Crazy Martin, who had planted all his barley this year. Every farmer with half a brain had planted beans. That was one good thing about all the fighting. Soldiers ate beans and prices would be high. After a few more drinks, deeper concerns were voiced. Deserter soldiers and other opportunists were thick on the roads, making even short trips risky. The roads were always bad, of course, in the same way that winter was always cold. You could complain, took sensible precautions, and got on the business of living your life. But this was different. Over the last 2 months, the roads had become so bad that people had stopped complaining. The last caravan had 2 wagons and 4 guards. The merchant had been asking 10 pennies for half a pound of salt, 15 for a loaf of sugar. He didn't have any pepper or cinnamon or chocolate. He did have 1 small sack of coffee, but he wanted 2 silver talents for that. At first people had laughed at his prices, and then, when he held firm, folk had spat and cursed at him. He had been 2 span ago, 22 days. There had not been another serious trader since, even though this was the season for it. So despite the third levy tax looming large in everyone's minds, people were looking in their purses and wishing they bought a little something just in case the snow came early. No one spoke of the previous night, of the thing they had burned and buried. Other folk were talking, of course. The town was alive with gossip. Carter's wounds ensured that the stories were taken half seriously, but not much more than half. The word demon was being spoken, but it was with smiles, half hidden behind raised hands. Only the 6 friends had seen the thing before it was burned. One of them had been wounded, and the other had been drinking. The priest had seen it too, but it was his job to see demons. Demons were good for his business. The innkeeper had seen it too, apparently, but he wasn't from around here. He couldn't know the truth that was so apparent to everyone born and raised in this little town. Stories were told here, and they happened somewhere else. This was not a place for demons. Besides, things were bad enough without borrowing trouble. Cobb and the rest knew that there was no sense talking about it. Trying to convince folk would only make them a laughing stock, like Crazy Martin, who had been trying to dig a well inside his own house for years now. Still, each of them bought a piece of cold wrought iron from the smith, heavy as they could swing, and none of them said what they were thinking. Instead, they complained that the roads were bad and getting worse. They talked about merchants and deserters and levies and not enough salt to last the winter. They reminisced that 3 years ago no one would have even thought of locking their doors at night, let alone burying them. The conversations took a downturn from there, and even though none of them said what they were thinking, the evening ended on a grim note. Most evenings did these days, times being what they were. And that's the end of chapter 1. Woo!
I'll take that 2-minute break.
Yeah, I want to take a 5-10 minute break, if that's okay.
So whoever muted the IR bot can unmute them for a little elevator music while we drink and get water.
Yeah. I hope you guys are enjoying it so far!
I'll get you an actual bookmark.
That's lame. I like that bookmark.
I'll get you a picture. The picture there over there. You can use a picture.
I don't want to. I want something smaller.
Use one of the wallet bookmarks.
No, it's still too big.
Really? Too big?
You have to have something that's proportional for the size of the book. I'm gonna write that I'm taking a small break. A beautiful day.
Stop recording.
Alright.
Sure.
One more sip of water before we start. It was one of those perfect autumn days so common in stories and so rare in the real world. The weather was warm and dry, ideal for ripening a field of wheat or corn. On both sides of the road the trees were changing color. Tall poplars had gone a buttery yellow, while the shrubbery sumac encroaching on the road was tinged a violent red. Only the old oaks seemed reluctant to give up the summer, and their leaves retained an even mingling of gold and green. Everything said you couldn't hope for a nicer day to have half a dozen ex-soldiers with hunting bows relieve you of everything you owned. She's not much of a horse, sir, chronicler said.
One small step above a dray when it rains, she...
The man cut him off with a sharp gesture.
Listen, friend. King's army is paying good money for anything with 4 legs and at least 1 good eye. If you're stark mad and riding a hobby horse down the road, I'd still take it off you.
Their leader had an air of command about him. Chronicler guessed he had been a low-ranking officer not long ago.
Just hop down,
he said seriously.
We'll get this done with and you can be on your way.
Chronicler climbed down from his horse. He had been robbed before and knew that there was nothing to be gained by discussion. These fellows knew their business. No energy was wasted on bravo or idle threats. One of them looked over the horse, checking hooves, teeth, and harness. 2 others went through his saddlebags with a military efficiency, laying all his worldly possessions out on the ground. 2 blankets, a hooded cloak, a flat leather satchel, and his heavy, well-stocked travel sack.
That's all of it, Commander,
one of the men said.
Except for about 20 pounds of oats.
The commander knelt down and opened the flat leather satchel, peering inside.
There's nothing but paper and pens in there,
the chronicler said. The commander turned to look backwards over his shoulder.
You scribe, then?
Chronicler nodded.
It's my livelihood, sir, and no real use to you.
The man looked through the satchel, found it to be true, and set it aside. He then upended the travel sack onto Chronicler's spread cloak and poked idly through the contents. He took most of the Chronicler's salt and a pair of bootlaces, and then, much to the scribe's dismay, he picked up the shirt the Chronicler had bought back in Linwood. It was fine linen dyed a deep royal blue, too nice for traveling. The Chronicler hadn't even had the chance to wear it yet. He sighed. The commander left everything else lying on the cloak and got to his feet. The others took turns going through the chronicler's things. The commander spoke up.
You only have 1 blanket, don't you, Jones?
One of the men nodded.
Take one of his, then. You'll need a second before the wind's through. His cloak's in better shape than mine, sir. Take it, but leave yours. Same for you, Whitkins. Leave your own tinderbox if you've taken his.
Lost mine, sir, Whitkins said. Else I would. The whole process was surprisingly civilized. Chronicler lost all of his needles but one, both extra pairs of socks, a bundle of dried fruit, a small loaf of sugar, half a bottle of alcohol, and a pair of ivory dice. They left him the rest of his clothes, his dried meat, a half-eaten loaf of incredibly stale rye bread. His flat leather satchel remained untouched. While the men repacked his travel sack, the commander turned to the chronicler.
"Let's have the purse, then."
The chronicler handed it over.
"And the ring."
"There's hardly any silver in it," the chronicler mumbled as he unscrewed it from his finger.
"What's that around your neck?"
The chronicler unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a dull ring of metal hanging from a leather cord.
"Just iron, sir."
The commander came close and rubbed it between his fingers, letting it fall back against the chronicler's chest.
"Keep it, then. I'm not one to come between a man and his religion,"
he said, and then emptied the purse into one hand, making a pleasantly surprised noise as he prodded through the coins with his finger.
"Scribing pays better than I thought,"
he said as he began to count out shares to his men.
"I don't suppose you could spare me a penny or two out of that?"
the chronicler asked.
"Just enough for a couple of hot meals."
The 6 men turned to look at the chronicler, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had heard. The commander laughed.
"God's body, you certainly have a heavy pair, don't you?"
There was a grudging respect in his voice.
"You seem a reasonable fellow,"
the chronicler said with a shrug.
"And man's gotta eat."
Their leader smiled for the first time.
"A sentiment I can agree with."
He took out 2 pennies and brandished them before putting them back into the chronicler's purse.
"Here's a pair for your pair, then."
He tossed the chronicler the purse and stuffed the beautiful royal blue shirt into his saddlebag.
"Thank you, sir,"
the chronicler said.
"You might want to know that bottle one of your men took is wood alcohol I use for cleaning my pens. It'll go badly if he drinks it."
Commander smiled and nodded.
"You see what comes of treating people well,"
he said to his men as he pulled himself up onto his horse.
"It's been a pleasure, Sir Scribe. If you get on your way now, you can still make Abbott's Ford by dark."
When Chronicler could no longer hear their hoofbeats in the distance, he repacked his travel sack, making sure everything was well stowed. Then he tugged off one of his boots, stripped out the lining, and removed a tightly wrapped bundle of coins stuffed deep into the toe. He moved some of these into his purse, and then unfastened his pants, produced another bundle of coins from underneath several layers of clothing, and moved some of that money into his purse as well. The key was to keep the proper amount in your purse. Too little and they'd be disappointed and prone to look for more. Too much and they'd be excited and might get greedy. There's a 3rd bundle of coin baked into the stale loaf of bread that only the most desperate of criminals would be interested in. He left that alone for now, as well as the whole silver talent he had hidden in a jar of ink. Over the years, he had come to think of the last as more of a luck piece. No one ever found that. He had to admit it was probably the most civil robbery he'd ever been through. They had been genteel. Right there. Genteel, efficient, and not terribly savvy. Losing the horse and the saddle was hard, but he could buy another in Abbott's Ford, and still had enough money to live comfortably until he finished this foolishness and met up with Scarpi in Treia. Feeling an urgent call of nature, Chronicler pushed his way through the blood-red sumach, and at the side of the road, as he was rebuttoning his pants, there was a sudden motion in the underbrush as a dark shape thrashed its way free from some nearby bushes. The chronicler staggered back, crying out in alarm, before he realized it was nothing more than a crow beating its wings into flight. Chuckling at his own foolishness, he straightened his clothes and made his way back to the road through the sumach, brushing away invisible strands of spider web that clung tickling to his face. As he shouldered his travel sack and satchel, Chronicler found himself feeling remarkably light-hearted. The worst had happened, and it hadn't been that bad. A breeze tussled through the trees, sending poplar leaves spinning like golden coins down onto the rutted dirt road. It was a beautiful day.